All very welcome. This session is on competency-based interviews, and my own name is Elaine Kiley. I'm one of the careers team here in UL. Essentially, I suppose the focus today is on competencies, and just maybe to kickstart, and I might, if you want to either use the chat function or raise a hand and turn on your microphone, ask you, what do you think is the difference between a skill and a competency? Would anyone have a suggestion around that? So, Kira, I know you said you were going for an interview tomorrow. Would you be willing to give it a shot? What do you think is the difference between a skill and a competency?
Is a skill something that's specific to, say, whatever you're doing, and a competency is something that's a bit more broad and across the board, as in like how you deal with certain situations and things like that. Not very good. I told you I wasn't sure.
That's okay. Yeah, and no, and I mean, I think that's why it's good, because like oftentimes you'll actually hear them being used interchangeably. You know, they'll talk about like kind of skills and competencies, but I suppose if I were to kind of put it in a nutshell, I would say the difference between a skill and a competency is the difference between a what and a how. So a skill tells you like your abilities, what you can do, and it's generally like kind of a learned behavior. So giving a presentation, driving a car, performing brain surgery. So obviously a skill will vary in complexity and knowledge, and learning, for example. But the competency tells you how you do the job. So it includes your behaviors and your attitudes. So really a competency is more than just a skill. It's the skill, so the learned activity plus the behavior plus the attitude. And so when employers talk about competency-based interviews, they're looking for like kind of that combination. So it's not just the what you do, but it's the how you do or how you did something in the past. And the reason being is that if you can give a sense of how you did something in the past, that's a very good predictor for how you'll do in the future or how you'll do in the present. And that's why competencies tend to be used by employers for screening and selecting, in interviews and in assessment centers. And so the idea is that an employer will have a range of competencies that they're looking for, so that combination of skill and behavior, and that they'll test the candidates knowledge of that, like kind of that competency area, through asking the candidate to tell stories about their past experience of using a competency. Now, I mean, so oftentimes you'll find, in an interview, and we'll see that in a second, that like kind of when an employer wants to find out about competency, what they're saying is, can you tell me about a time that you showed XYZ? Can you tell me about a time, for example, that you showed good customer service? Or can you tell me about a time that you showed good attention to detail? Or that you worked as part of a team, or that you showed leadership, like kind of ability? So they're all competency-based questions. And the idea is that you would have a story to match like kind of that question that you're being asked. So the first thing that you need to do then in order to have that story is to start to identify your competencies. So there's a couple of ways that you can do that. But one of the things that like kind of, that we'd say is that if you want, because in particular, because a competency is about how you do something, not just the what, it's the what plus the how. You also need to think of like kind of a list of the skills from your job description. So that's step one. You get the job description and you look down through that and you identify what are the skills or competencies that the employer is looking for. Step two then for you is to think about, okay, what would be the behaviors that would show that competency in its best light? So like if we take teamwork, for example, what makes one person better at teamwork than another? So is it, someone who's got like really good listening skills, so they're listening to their teammates? Is it someone who's really inclusive? Is it someone that gets stuck in terms of doing the work? Is it someone that's happy to lead by example, so take on like kind of the responsibilities? Is it someone who's very good at facilitating and what I'd often call like scaffolding what other people say, so they're building on the information. Maria, you're very welcome. This is being recorded, and if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I can address them. We've just started only a few minutes. And so what you want to think about is like kind of when you're thinking about the competency is not just what the activity is, but also that sense of the behaviors and the attitudes that go with it. And then when you're being asked in an interview about your competencies, it's about evidence. So it's about specific examples to show your evidence of whatever that like competency example is. So it's in essence, if you can think of it as telling a story. So each time the employer asks a question, they are looking for a specific story from your past that will give them insight as to whether you have that competency or not. And so where might you look to find your own competency? So, through your undergraduate degree or postgraduate degree, for example, modules like, for example, when we were talking about teamwork there, oftentimes a very good example would be team-based projects that you have to do. If you've had a co-op placement or internships, or indeed other like kind of work experience, whether it's summer work experience or other professional experience. So in those types of environments, you will always have the opportunity to build on your communication and your customer, your attention to detail, your time management, your teamwork, your leadership. Other areas where you could be developing your competencies would be through your extracurricular and sports activities, or indeed volunteering. So these are all the kind of arenas where you can, showcase or can think about to find ways to give evidence to your competencies. So the way that you might do that, and I suppose there's a couple of different options, and I say like kind of say if we're talking about the general to the specific, you might say, okay, what is teamwork? So you think about, the definition. And now I'm taking a very broad definition of teamwork here: work collaboratively with others to achieve goals. But if you were to look at teamwork in the context of the job that you're applying for, what would that look like? What are they looking for? Is it working, across teams in a company? Is it working with different departments? Could it be working internationally with like kind of different teams? Um, could it be about like kind of engaging with the client as well as like kind of your colleagues? So teamwork will have like kind of different, I suppose, you might have a different definition depending on which role you're going for. And then you want to think about the behaviors. So what would be a very strong, if we're thinking of the how, if I wanted to say, how would someone show me teamwork to a high standard? So does their fair share of the work, takes on the work, tries the different tasks, understands the impact of their actions on others, shares information. And so then if you were thinking that they're all the behaviors, can I think of a time in my past? So that's your objective, is to think of a specific example where you demonstrated as many of those behaviors as possible. So if I were to throw it over to you, I suppose, at the moment, and if you look here at these examples, first of all, I'm asking you to rate yourself. So if you look at the 10 examples of competencies down the list here, starting with relationship building, teamwork, motivation, problem solving, to taking initiative, results orientation, and communication skills, how would you score yourself at the moment on those? Would you give yourself a 3 that you demonstrate that competency very well, a 2 for satisfactory, or a 1 for needs work? Now you don't have to share that with me, but I'm going to give you a minute to look down that list and just even kind of have a think and reflect on the score that you'd give yourself. Okay, so if you've had a look then and scored yourself 1, 2, or 3 on that list of 10 competencies, the next thing that takes a little bit more time is to think about a specific example. So can you think about a time where you demonstrated problem solving skills, or that you showed customer focus or client focus or adaptability. And I suppose this is the bit that, takes like kind of the time and takes the reflection. It's possibly, you may have lots of examples, but what you want to do then is showcase the example that would be best suited to the interview that you're going for. So this is the bit that will take a little bit of time after the session for you to kind of go through. But it's like what I suggested in the last slide is that, what you want to think about are, sorry, 2 slides ago, I should say, that think through what you're studying at the moment, think through past work experience, extracurricular, sports activities, and volunteering, that these are a good place to find examples of these stories that you can tell, or this evidence to showcase your competencies. And what I have is a free online competencies assessment tool that you can do. So you could take that like kind of the 123test.com in your own time. So how does all of this then fit into interviews? So competency-based interviews are very popular with employers because the idea is that your past behavior will indicate future performance. But it's also easy in a transparency way. It's easy for employers then to compare and score candidates against each other. So they're not asking, me one set of questions and the next candidate a different set. So everyone's being asked the same questions, and then it's easier for the employer to compare candidates against each other. And then you're scored against predetermined criteria. So what that means is that when you have, it's kind of nearly like if you take an interview score sheet, will have predetermined competencies that they want to find out about. So you look at the job and you think, what's the most important thing for this role? So if it's client focused, maybe they'll give 10 out of 100 as the mark that they want, that would be the like kind of the optimum score for someone in terms of client focus. Communication might get 20 out of 100, 20 marks. Your leadership might get 30. And so you pick the competencies. It may add up to 100, or it may add to up to 50, but essentially you are then being scored against a predetermined set of criteria. So they're saying these are the behaviors of someone who would have a very good client focused set of behaviors or ability, and then they're scoring you against that. And then they're also able to, as I said, compare you to other candidates, and that the questions then are quite structured, but they're looking on the specific skill that's needed for the role. So the questions will be, tell me about a time when you had to, or can you describe where you had to, or can you give me an example for? So they generally start like that, but they're looking for specific examples. So it's not saying, what do you think are the important aspects of teamwork? Instead, it's saying, can you describe a time when you had to work as part of a team? What was that like? What did you do? What was your role? What if there was conflict in the team? How did you deal with it? So they're the kinds of things that they want to ascertain. So when you're being asked, I suppose, those competency-based questions, it is thinking in terms of like real life situations. So you want to have, a bank of examples from your real life that you will be able to talk about in the interview. Um, and and the best method that we suggest in terms of preparing that is using like kind of this quite a simple tool, but this technique called the STAR technique. So it's the idea behind it is that it's a structure that you can use to answer that question, and it's using the 4 letters STAR, where within each of those sections you're like kind of addressing the question. So you're given the situation. So what was the situation or the project you were involved with? What was the task that you had? So that's T. So S for situation, T for task, A for action, and R for result. So the situation and task, if you were to think of it, that's really just setting the scene for the employer, for the audience that's asked you the question. So really a one line for each of those is plenty. The action is the bit that's hugely important in your interview, or indeed on an application form. You'll often see that these types of competency questions are used on application forms as well as interviews. So the action is, what you did. So in particular, you need to be careful, say if you're talking about teamwork, that you don't want to keep saying we, you want to use I. But it's nearly like listing all of the actions that you took to achieve a result, whatever the outcome was. Now, the other thing about the outcome is that, sometimes the result won't always be positive. In as much as possible, you want your example to have a positive result, but sometimes it can be about like kind of having learned something from the experience. So, your result could also include a reflection of what you do differently next time. But the idea being that if you were asked that question, tell me about a time you, or can you describe a situation when you, and demonstrated whatever the competency is, you would use that STAR technique. That's the storytelling technique to frame and structure your answer. Um, so I mentioned already, you don't want to use we and not I. So that's like a common mistake that candidates like kind of will make when they're answering competency-based questions, whether that's on paper or in an interview face to face. Sometimes it is difficult to think about examples, but and you'll often see, for example, if you're asked, can you tell me about a time you had to deal with a difficult customer? It might be very tempting to say, well, when I get a difficult customer, this is what I do. But that's not a specific example. You need to identify on one occasion, the customer who was angry, and that's your S, like kind of in T, and what were the actions like kind of that you took. And the other thing, as I said, remember to use I and not we. So, in summary, when you're preparing for a competency based interview, you need to obviously research the company and read the job description, because you need to go and look through the skills and competencies that the employer wants, and you want to match them then with your examples. You need to do some identifying of your own skills and competencies and using as much of your past experience as you can to do that. So, that will include college, work, co op, volunteering, sports, extracurricular. And then you want to use the STAR method to structure how you might like kind of answer that question. So you don't have to write out like kind of, a detailed answer, just have some bullet points that you could talk through. But remember that when you're doing that, it's the A that's the most important bit to kind of fill in. So you're only giving one line for the S, one line for the T. The detail is in the A, the action that you took, and again, one line for the R to summarize, the result or the outcome or the reflection, as I said, from the story, the competency story that you're telling. um, and you want to like kind of, I suppose, think in terms of those specific examples, if from a variety of like kind of options. So sometimes you'll find that, say for example, you'll have loads of stories from co-op, which is great, but you want to try and have like kind of a variety, because you might find that you might be asked for a second example sometimes. And then practice your answers. So it's a good idea like kind of to practice, and you will become more confident as you speak, in terms of practicing. And a really useful tool that we have in the career service that you can use for practicing is our practice video interviews under Shortlist Me. So you can log in to UL Shortlist Me, and you can click on the practice interview that you'd like to take. You'll be asked a brief registration. You will get a link, and you'll be sent, you'll have up to 5 days to practice that interview. And you'll be sent a report then with access to your answers. And there will be some AI feedback which looks at pace of speech and number of filler words that you use, which is very useful. So I think there's a couple of benefits to using Shortlist Me. One, it'll get you into the practice of answering questions. It'll give you sample questions that you may find regularly come up in graduate style interviews, but it will also give you that like kind of AI feedback around the pace and the filler words, which I think are very useful. Um, so that's like a brief run through competency interviews. I suppose the big thing is in terms of, practicing yourself, maybe thinking about your STAR stories, using Shortlist Me. But of course, if you wanted to meet with myself or any of the team face to face, and that's also an option. And the best way to do that is to make an appointment on Careers Connect. So I hope you found that useful. I'll stop the recording now, but I'm happy to answer any questions any of you might have. So thanks a million for listening, and bear with me while I just pop this on stop.